The sharp pop of a champagne cork echoed through the first-class cabin, silent as a cathedral. For most, it was the sound of luxury. But for Marcus Ellison, it struck like a slap at 35,000 feet, the sound that marked the moment he was stripped of his most precious possession, his dignity. He wasn't denied a drink, he was denied recognition of his very humanity. Atlas Airways Flight 112 was preparing for departure from New York's JFK to London Heathrow. Outside, the city's glittering lights reflected off the polished fuselage of the Boeing 777, while inside the first-class cabin glowed in a soft golden hue, a sanctuary of dark leather seats turned away from the world private pristine, a tiny kingdom of power. In seat 2, a Marcus leaned back, slipping off his charcoal brownie jacket to reveal a slate hoodie, the unofficial uniform of modern tech royalty. 39-years-old founder of Ellison Dynamics, the man who forced the global logistics industry to rewrite its rules with his predictive AI platform, respected by Wall Street, revered in Silicon Valley. But today, he was simply a weary man, drained from 8 days of non-stop negotiations in Manhattan. All he wanted was a quiet flight and a glass of champagne to close out a hellish week. The flight attendant appeared Linda Barrett, 56, with a sharp, disciplined face softened by faint makeup, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun like a monument to order. She moved down the aisle, her professional smile flickering on automatically. She laughed warmly with the man in seat 1A, a portly businessman in a pinstripe suit. She chatted with the couple in seats 1F and 1G, offering hot towels with both hands. But when she reached 2A, the smile disappeared. Linda paused, glancing down at the man in the grey hoodie with AirPods in his ears. Her gaze chilled for half a second, long enough for someone as perceptive as Marcus to feel it. "Would you like something before takeoff, sir?" Her tone was polite, steady but void of warmth. Marcus looked up, his voice even and clear, firm as a steady drumbeat. "Champagne, please, if possible. Pol Roger Winston Churchill, the kind you usually serve in this cabin." Linda hesitated, a faint furrow creasing her brow almost unconsciously. "Pol Roger, sir," she repeated, as if she'd just heard something absurd. "That's right." Marcus nodded politely, still composed. "The champagne you serve for Imperial class, isn't that correct? We may not be serving that particular one at this time," Linda said quickly, her tone clipped. "I can bring orange juice or still water." Marcus's smile didn't fade, but something inside him sank. He had flown this route dozens of times, knew the ritual by heart. Champagne was always served before takeoff. He glanced towards seat 1A, where the white man was raising a glass of golden bubbles beneath the soft cabin light, a living contradiction. Marcus spoke slowly, still courteous. "I believe it's available, isn't it? The gentleman in 1A is having some." Linda's eyes flicked toward the passenger, then back, her expression now cold as stone. "We have limited quantities, sir. We need to ensure there's enough for the entire flight. Just one line." But it landed like a verdict. The cabin went silent. The man in 2C, Thomas Reed, pretended to read his magazine, but his eyes shifted sideways. Marcus could feel the air thicken, heavy, with the familiar weight of being judged. He'd felt it before, the skeptical glance, the polite condescension, the apology that always came wrapped in arrogance. At the hotel desk, in boardrooms, at receptions, each time he swallowed his pride. But not today. He was too tired. He set his tablet down, his voice low but firm. "Mrs. Barrett, I am a first-class passenger. listed by name a diamond member of Atlas Airways. I am simply asking for a glass of wine, clearly listed on your standard service menu. No raised voice, no threats, but each word carried the authority of a man used to commanding markets. A flush crept up Linda's neck, a mix of embarrassment and irritation. Yet instead of retreating, she doubled down. Turning to Thomas Reed, she softened her tone to syrup. "Mr. Reed, may I offer you a glass of Pol Roger to begin your flight?" The air froze. Thomas stammered, Just water, thank you." Linda's smile vanished. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked briskly toward the galley. No champagne, no orange juice. Nothing. She erased him from her service altogether. Marcus sat motionless. The low hum of the engines deepened into a distant roar, like the growl of anger waiting to be unleashed. To anyone else it might have been a small misunderstanding, but to Marcus Ellison it was the final drop that broke the dam, the crack that split apart the illusion he'd held for years that success could erase prejudice. He looked out the window. The airport lights drifted backward as the pushback tug locked onto the plane's nose. A slight shudder signaled the start of the taxi. He pulled out his phone just minutes before losing signal. To anyone watching it looked like he was checking emails, but in truth, he was triggering a financial earthquake. "Daniel," he typed to his CFO, "sell everything, all shares of Atlas Airways, execute at market open." Another message followed. "Cancel Project Horizon. Notify Goldman. State reason breach of partnership ethics." He pressed send. On the screen, the word "delivered" flashed just before the signal vanished. Marcus placed the phone down and leaned back, the cabin light painting half his face, in gold, half in shadow, a calm, dangerous stillness. There would be no champagne for him on this flight. But as the aircraft lifted off the runway, he knew one thing for certain: Atlas Airways would never have an ordinary flight again. The engines roared. Outside New York shrank into a blur of dim lights. Inside, one man had just ignited the greatest financial storm in aviation history, all because of a glass of champagne that was never poured. 7 hours across the Atlantic, 7 hours long enough to turn even the calmest man into a silent storm. In the first-class cabin of Atlas Airways, Flight 112. The lights had dimmed to a soft blue, the curtains were drawn, and only the steady hum of the engines remained like the heartbeat of a massive metal beast tearing through the night. But in seat 2, a Marcus Ellison's eyes stayed open. Not because he couldn't sleep, but because he was calculating. On his laptop screen, the confidential files of Project Horizon were open, a contract worth $250 million, the technological heart of Atlas and AI. System developed by Ellison Dynamics, designed to predict cargo routes and save hundreds of millions a year. A masterpiece of engineering, a symbol of partnership between two industry giants, and now he was about to erase it. But this was no longer personal, no longer just about a glass of wine. To Marcus, that humiliation was a symptom of a disease, the disease of systemic prejudice. An airline whose staff believed they had the right to decide who was worthy of being served was a company already rotting from within. He remembered his first handshake with Richard Whitmore, the CEO of Atlas, a man in his 60s with perfectly combed silver hair and the booming voice of a classic American gentleman. Whitmore had proudly said that Atlas prided itself on preserving the legacy of the 1960s. Now Marcus understood that those words weren't a compliment, but a curtain-hiding stagnation, arrogance, and discrimination. He couldn't allow his company to be tied to such a partner, couldn't let Ellison Dynamics, the symbol of progress, innovation, and equality, be dragged down by an outdated system. Marcus closed his laptop and looked around the cabin. Flight attendant Linda Barrett was nowhere in sight. He knew she was hiding behind the thin galley curtain, avoiding the gaze of the man she thought was just a strange passenger in a hoodie. He wasn't angry, not anymore. Marcus's anger didn't come like fire, it came like ice cold, slow and merciless. He took out his phone, opened the secure Eclipse app, and sent an encrypted message to Daniel Park, his CFO. Confirm execution. Call Mark Alvarez at Goldman. Sell 4.5 million shares of AALX at market. No negotiations. No dark pool make the impact visible. Then another message, followed draft the press release to terminate Project Horizon. Reason misalignment of corporate culture and values. Send at 9:45 a.m., New York time. It wasn't just a financial move, it was a philosophical strike. In London, the clock showed 2 in the morning. Daniel Park sat in his high-rise apartment, overlooking the Thames, holding a cup of cold coffee. His phone buzzed a message from Marcus. He read it and nearly dropped the cup. Sell all positions in Atlas. Sell everything. Daniel called immediately. Marcus, are you sure? Selling 7% of the shares in one go will crash the price. You know that it'll... The line went silent. Then Marcus's calm, steady voice came through. I know. And that's what I want. The call ended with a chill, like the sound of wind slicing past the aircraft's fuselage. Daniel sat frozen for a few seconds. He knew Marcus never acted out of emotion. If he had given the order, every detail had already been calculated, to the second, to the dollar. On the plane, Marcus opened the window shade. The sky outside was pitch black, the ocean below endless and invisible. The city lights were long gone. He smiled faintly, though even he couldn't tell whether it was sorrow or resolve. In his mind, images flashed Linda's contemptuous stare, Whitmore's forced smile, the memory of a 10-year-old black boy being thrown out of a store because you can't afford anything here. All of it blended together into a slow building wave. A part of him still wanted to believe in goodness, but the other part, the one that had built a technology empire from nothing, knew that justice doesn't happen on its own. The plane trembled slightly as it passed through a pocket of turbulence. The seatbelt light blinked its reflection, flickering in Marcus's eyes like cold steel. He thought of the passengers sleeping peacefully around him, unaware that by the time they landed, a multi-billion-dollar company would collapse. For a moment, he caught a glimpse of Linda emerging from the galley, her eyes darting away. She had no idea, couldn't possibly know, that her small act had just triggered a global financial earthquake. Marcus didn't hate her. He simply returned the world a lesson. Sometimes the price of prejudice is an entire empire. Across the Atlantic, London's night was unnaturally still. At Goldman Sachs, servers were programming automated sale orders for the morning. Each click was a financial bullet being loaded. And somewhere above the clouds, Marcus closed his eyes. He could hear the engines clearly, no longer as noise, but as the ticking of a countdown. 7 hours later, when the sun rose over New York Atlas Airways, would burn on the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange. Beneath the thick clouds, the Atlantic waves churned like the heartbeat of an approaching storm. Marcus no longer knew if he was angry. Perhaps not. What he felt now was a cold serenity, the calm of a man who believes that even ruthless actions can still be just. To him, respect could never be bought with money, and a system that doesn't respect human dignity deserves to be dismantled like a rusted machine. The Boeing 777 pierced through the final layer of clouds, entering the tranquil sky of the European dawn. The first rays of sunlight spilled through the window, washing over Marcus's face, the face of a man who had just ordered the destruction of an empire, yet sat calmly, as if he'd merely completed a logical equation. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to threaten, only one message, one command, one line of text, one reason of culture, one press of a button, enough to send Atlas Airways plummeting not from the sky, but from the summit of its own arrogance. And somewhere in the night, as the financial servers hummed in preparation for a chaotic morning, the anger of Marcus Ellison, a voiceless, frozen fury, had already begun to spread, cold, precise, and unstoppable. 9:29 a.m. New York time. The New York Stock Exchange lit up in the chaotic symphony of bells, keyboards, and the hoarse shouts of hundreds of traders waiting for the first signal of the day. In a corner of Goldman Sachs's trading command room, Mark Alvarez placed his hands on the keyboard. In front of him was a sell order, with a short note, Ellison Dynamics, 4,500,000 shares of AALX. Market open. No negotiation, no delay, no dark pool. A direct cold command, and in the language of finance, a brutal one. Execute, Mark said. One word, and it sounded like the opening shot of a war. 9:30 a.m. The opening bell rang. Within 5 seconds, the first block of 500,000 shares of Atlas Airways, ticker AALX, hit the floor like a boulder crashing into still water. The listed price was $42.15. Then it immediately dropped to $39.80. 20 seconds later, the second block fell, then the third, then the fourth. In the first 90 seconds, AALX stock lost over 12% of its value. On the massive digital board, red numbers streamed across the screen like blood spreading on white cloth. In the center of the floor, the lead specialist for MJA Atlas Airways code shouted into his radio, "What's happening with AALX? Who's dumping this volume?" No one answered because, at that level, there were no buyers left. High-frequency trading algorithms detected the abnormal volume. They instantly triggered a short cascade, dumping millions of shares, betting the price would fall even further. As wave after wave of sell orders poured in, the exchange's system flashed a high volatility risk warning. Within 3 minutes, AALX hit $33. 1 minute later, it broke through 30. The trading floor erupted. Brokers screamed into their phones, voices cracking in panic. Which company's under attack? Who's dumping millions of AALX shares? A few blocks away on the 45th floor of Atlas Tower, Richard Whitmore was sitting in his Monday morning executive meeting, what he liked to call the gentleman's breakfast. On the wall, an LED screen displayed the company's latest advertisement, Atlas Airways, where legacy meets the future. He was smiling, espresso steaming in hand, listening to his marketing director boast about 80 years of flawless service and tradition. Then his phone buzzed, once, twice, 3 times, followed by pounding on the door. George Mason, the company's chief legal officer, burst in, face pale. "Richard, for God's sake, you need to see this." He threw a tablet on the table. On the screen, Atlas Airways stock was plunging like a nosedive without a parachute. The red graph spread like veins drained of blood. 42.15, 39, 50.33, 70.29, 80.27, 40. A near vertical drop. Whitmore stared. Is it the whole market? Is there a war? Is Nasdaq crashing too? George shook his head, voice trembling. No, just us. AALX has been dumped nearly 7% of total shares in 10 minutes from one major institutional investor. Wall Street's calling it a targeted strike. The room fell silent, heavy as lead. Executives looked at each other, their expensive ties now resembling nooses. Whitmore struggled to stay composed. Call Ellison Dynamics. Marcus would never. His sentence was cut off by the piercing ring of the desk phone. His assistant rushed in, face white as paper. Mr. Whitmore Brenda Cole from the Wall Street Journal on line 1. She says it's urgent, and she knows who's selling. The name Brenda Cole hit the table like a weight. She didn't call for small news. She only called when someone was dying on the market. Whitmore picked up, swallowing hard. Brenda. I'm in a meeting right now. Can I? Richard Brenda's voice was cold as steel. I just confirmed from an inside source at Goldman Sachs. The seller is Ellison Dynamics. They just dumped 4.5 million shares of Atlas Airways. And I have their upcoming press statement. Whitmore froze. A chill of sweat crept down his neck. You said what statement? Brenda replied. An official termination of Project Horizon, effective immediately. Reason a severe misalignment of corporate culture and values. Whitmore's mouth hung open, the phone shaking in his hand, and Brenda continued, lowering her voice. My source says it all started with a flight. Flight 112 from JFK to London. A first-class service incident involving Marcus Ellison himself. The air in the room vanished. Whitmore's legs gave way, his fingers trembling. The entire board of directors stared at him like a man about to be sentenced. One executive stammered. Because of a service issue on a flight, he destroyed the company. Whitmore didn't respond. On the screen, the graph plunged past $25. 9:46 a.m. Ellison Dynamics' statement went public. Just a short paragraph, but every word cut like a knife. After a strategic review of our partners, we have determined that Atlas Airways no longer aligns with the cultural standards and core values of Ellison Dynamics. Therefore, we are terminating all collaborations, including Project Horizon and our equity holdings. 10 minutes later, the circuit breaker triggered. AALX. Trading was halted entirely, the final price frozen at $23.18, down 44% in under an hour. In a small house in Queens, Linda Barrett was preparing to leave for her noon yoga class. The radio played a financial bulletin between soft tunes. Atlas Airways stock collapsed this morning after tech giant Ellison Dynamics unexpectedly sold all its shares and cancelled a $250 million technology contract. Analysts attribute the move to a major cultural conflict between the two companies. The glass of water in Linda's hand nearly slipped. The words Ellison Dynamics echoed, summoning an image in her mind. The man in seat 2. The grey hoodie. The calm, unreadable eyes. Impossible. The phone rang. A cold female voice from Atlas headquarters said, Mrs. Barrett, this is Sandra from Human Resources. You don't need to report for tonight's flight. Please be at the JFK office by 2 p.m. You are suspended indefinitely. The call ended. Linda stood frozen, then collapsed into a chair. Everything she had believed was order had now shattered because of a single glass of wine that was never poured. 10:30 a.m. Brenda Cole's article appeared on the Wall Street Journal homepage, CEO. Marcus Ellison brings down Atlas Airways after first-class service incident. Sources confirm the event occurred on Flight 112 when Mr. Ellison was denied premium champagne, leading to a billion-dollar market sell-off. Beneath the headline, the hashtags Atlas Fall and Lost Majesty swept across social media. Within 2 hours, more than $1.2 billion in market value evaporated from Atlas Airways. 11 a.m. on the runway at Heathrow, the Atlas Airways 777 from Flight 112 touched down smoothly. Marcus Ellison exited, first stepping through the jet bridge. The London morning light fell across his face, calm, almost serene. In his pocket, his phone vibrated. A message from Daniel Atlas is burning. They've lost nearly half their value. Whitmore's in an emergency meeting. Marcus replied, "Good. Don't interfere. Let them bleed." He walked on, blending into the crowd. No one recognized the man in the grey hoodie who had just brought down a century-old airline in 90 minutes. Sometimes the greatest anger needs no threats, just a single touch on the market, and the entire world listens. 11:30 a.m. Wall Street still had not caught its breath after the seismic crash called Atlas Airways, but on the 45th floor of Atlas Tower, where the scent of oak and expensive coffee still lingered in the air, Richard Whitmore, once hailed by Business Heritage magazine as the soul of American aviation, was watching his legacy turn to ash. The giant screen in the boardroom showed a haunting line. AALX trading halted at $23.18, down 44%. The chiefs of finance, legal, and marketing stood or sat in scattered clusters, but no one dared meet another's eyes. The entire room sank into a murky silence, like the ringing in your ears after an explosion. Whitmore braced his hands on the table, trembling slightly. How could this happen? In just a few hours. George Mason, the head of legal, answered softly. Mr. Ellison calculated every step. They sold the stake right at the open, then released the statement 15 minutes later. Investors understood immediately. Atlas has lost the confidence of its most important technology partner. And the media, they are burning us alive, Richard. At that moment, his assistant burst in, pale, holding out a phone. You should see the new piece from the Wall Street Journal. On the screen, Atlas Airways collapses after first-class discrimination scandal. Beneath it, a photo of Marcus Ellison, taken at last year's Global AI conference with a cold caption, "Insiders confirm that the CEO of Ellison Dynamics was denied champagne on Atlas Flight 112, leading to a full divestment and the termination of the Horizon project, worth $250 million. Whitmore stared at the screen, his vision blurring for a moment. His fists clenched until the knuckles went white. Because of a glass of wine, he rasped, half laugh, half choke. He brought down an entire company over a glass of champagne. No one replied because everyone in that room knew it was not just a glass of wine. 10 kilometers away at Ellison Dynamics' London headquarters, Daniel Park was seated among the executive team, while each news update rolled across the LED wall. Financial advisors, attorneys, and communication specialists tracked the market's reaction. Daniel nodded slightly as Atlas's market cap plunged, and international outlets began to echo the Wall Street Journal. On the table, his phone lit up. A message from Marcus: maintain silence. No comments, no statements. Let the facts do the work. Daniel drew a long breath. He understood Marcus better than anyone. Marcus did not act out of anger. He acted to expose reality. In Marcus's eyes, the worst thing was not being insulted. It was a system that no longer knew where it was wrong. Meanwhile, at Atlas headquarters, urgent calls from major shareholders poured in. Some demanded an immediate board meeting. Others urged Whitmore to resign to restore market confidence. Worse still, a large institutional investor, Capstone Partners, sent a formal letter seeking damages for losses caused by weak governance that led to severe financial harm. Whitmore slammed the table, his voice cracking like thunder. We did nothing wrong. That was just one man's impulsive behavior. George answered quietly, fighting to stay calm. You still do not understand, Richard. This is no longer personal. This is a public verdict on how Atlas sees other people. Amid the chaos, Linda Barrett arrived at the Atlas Training Center at JFK, as instructed by Human Resources. A small room, harsh white fluorescent lights. A middle-aged brunette in glasses studied Linda over a thick case file. Mrs. Barrett, the woman began. Do you remember the incident on Flight 112? Linda swallowed, fingers laced. Yes, but I did not know who he was. I simply followed policy. Followed policy, the woman repeated, voice cold as a scalpel. A first-class passenger requested champagne, listed on the service menu. You refused, but then offered it to another passenger. Instead, correct. Linda lowered her head. Correct. And you felt that was reasonable. He did not look like the kind of client who usually sits in that cabin. The air congealed. The woman slid the file across the table, pressing each word. Exactly that mindset is why 8,000 people may lose their jobs today. Do you think you only refused a glass of wine? No, you refused a value. Linda said nothing. The sentence cut like a dagger, ripping through the thin armor of her defenses. While Atlas flailed like a sinking ship, Marcus Ellison sat in his London office as warm light washed the glass wall. He reviewed a draft of the next release, a softer explanation, prepared by PR, with the recommendation to avoid making the public think this was retaliation. He read it, then said only one line. Delete everything. Keep the original. Daniel looked at him and asked quietly, You are not afraid people will see you as ruthless as Marcus? Marcus smiled faintly, but there was something both pained and resolute in his eyes. Ruthless is letting systems like that continue to exist. I am not taking revenge, Daniel. I am treating a disease. He paused, gazing out the window. London lay blurred in mist. Do you know the greatest irony? He said softly. Atlas may lose billions of dollars, but if they grasp the real reason, that would be the greatest gain they have ever had. The next day, television broadcasts ran images of Atlas jets queued along runways, operations paused due to a liquidity crunch and a governance crisis. The stock remained suspended indefinitely. Flights were cancelled en masse. Every stream of cash ebbed away like the tide after a storm. On Wall Street, they called it the fastest collapse in the history of commercial aviation. That evening, in her small apartment in Queens, Linda Barrett turned on the television and saw Marcus's face on a special CNBC report. Along the bottom of the screen ran the caption, Marcus Ellison, the man who toppled a conglomerate to defend one word, respect. Linda began to cry, not out of fear, but because she realized too late that she had looked at a worthy man, and because of bias, failed to see the human being. Meanwhile, in London, Marcus quietly switched off the broadcast. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, not champagne, and murmured as if to himself, I didn't destroy them, they collapsed on their own. City lights fractured across the window, like golden cracks on an ancient wall. An empire had fallen, not because of finance, but because it forgot how to respect a person. And so, in an era of technology and speed, a single moment of contempt can be enough to bring down an entire world, not from the outside, but from deep within its own heart. 3 days after the Ellison storm, America still hadn't recovered. Wall Street was in chaos like a shattered beehive. Every financial network, every talk show, every hashtag revolved around one name, Marcus Ellison. Some called him the smartest avenger of the century. Others praised him as a symbol of justice. And still others saw him as a monster in a business suit, willing to burn an entire industry to the ground over his pride. But he, the only one who truly knew, said nothing. No interviews, no press conferences, just silence. A silence loud enough for the whole world to speak for him. Inside Ellison Dynamics headquarters, giant screens still glowed with the plunging charts of Atlas. At the table, Daniel Park presented the latest report. The stock price has dropped to $17.80. Investors have fled completely. Some are filing lawsuits against the Atlas board for ethical misconduct resulting in financial damage. Marcus didn't look up. He simply turned each page slowly as though reading a novel. Is Whitmore still there? Yes, but shareholders have demanded his resignation within 48 hours. Marcus nodded. Good. They still haven't learned the lesson, but they're starting to. Daniel hesitated. You know, Marcus, sometimes I wonder if Linda Barrett hadn't refused that glass of champagne, would Atlas still have fallen? Marcus looked up. In his eyes was a blend of sadness and clarity. No, Daniel. They were already falling. The champagne was just the first crack in the glass. Across the Atlantic, Richard Whitmore sat in a boardroom cold as a morgue. On the table lay a single document, his resignation as CEO, effective immediately. In front of him sat the blank faces of the board of directors, the same people who once toasted him at every anniversary banquet. Today they no longer saw him as a leader. They saw him as a disease to be removed. Whitmore forced a laugh, his voice dry and hollow. You all think I'm the only one to blame. Atlas was once the pride of a nation. We preserved tradition, we preserved service, excellence, and now we're condemned over a glass of wine. No one answered. The chairman spoke quietly. No, Richard. Because you forgot that this era doesn't need anyone treated like royalty. It needs every customer treated like a human being. Whitmore lowered his head. The noise around him faded away. He knew this story wouldn't end with the stock price. It would be taught in business schools, remembered as the textbook example of the cost of arrogance. Meanwhile, in Queens, a white envelope was left at the door of Linda Barrett's apartment. Inside was a letter from Atlas's disciplinary department. You are hereby terminated for severe discriminatory conduct in violation of the company's equality policy. This decision is effective immediately. Linda collapsed into a chair. On the television, the news showed images of Atlas aircraft lined up for liquidation. She stared at them, the 777s she had served on for 30 years now, nothing but cold steel corpses. A strangled laugh escaped her lips, then turned into tears, the first in years. Not because she lost her job, but because she finally realized she had been part of what killed Atlas. In London, Marcus stood by the window on the 70th floor of Ellison Dynamics. Outside, the city was wrapped in silver fog. He called Daniel. Prepare an assessment of Atlas's remaining assets. Daniel was stunned. You're planning to buy them. Marcus didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted far away. Not now. But when they're too weak to resist, I'll return. To finish them off, Marcus shook his head. To heal them. Some diseases can only be cured by letting them die first. Daniel stared at him for a long moment. He understood that behind that calm exterior was a heart scarred by a lifetime of prejudice, now choosing to rebuild the world through justice, even if the price was blood and ashes. On the 5th day after the collapse, Atlas was officially delisted. The federal court approved their Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The media called it the darkest day in American aviation since September 11th, but this time no plane fell. Only an empire did. Photos spread across the internet. Whitmore walking out of the building, face grey, no bodyguards, no luxury car. A small suitcase in hand marked property of Atlas Airways. A symbol of power turned into a symbol of downfall. That evening, Marcus received a call from Brenda Cole, the journalist who first broke the story to the world. "Do you want me to write part 2? She asked, her tone half challenge, half admiration. "Part 2, Marcus repeated. "Yes, the part where you become the financial dictator who destroyed a company out of pride. I'm sure it'll be just as popular as the first one." Marcus chuckled softly, a laugh free of anger. "Write it if you want. But if you're perceptive enough, end it with a single question." "What question?" Brenda asked. Marcus replied, "Whether justice can ever be done if the one holding it carries no anger at all." Brenda went silent, a question so profound that even the reporter who had exposed Wall Street's biggest secret had no answer. As night fell over London, Marcus stepped onto his balcony. The wind was sharp and cold, carrying the damp scent of rain. Below, the car lights reflected off the wet streets like glittering trails, the same light he had seen through the airplane window that night, right before sending that fateful message. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. No champagne, no cheers of victory, only stillness. The stillness of a man who knew he had just ended one chapter to begin the next, where he would no longer be the avenger, but the one rebuilding the world after the storm. In the empty room, the clock struck midnight. Marcus looked at his reflection in the glass. Behind him, the glowing blue letters spelled Ellison Dynamics. Before him, the city slept. He whispered softly to himself, "They call me ruthless. But sometimes it is compassion itself that drives a man to destroy what's rotten so something better can grow." Across the Atlantic in a small home in Queens, Linda Barrett was still awake. She looked up at the old radio as the nightly bulletin echoed Atlas Airways has officially declared bankruptcy. She sighed, choking back a sob, then murmured a line no one else could hear. "If only that day I had seen the man, instead of the color, maybe the whole world would be different." And somewhere amid the towers of glass, a man stood silently staring into the night, knowing his silence had become a warning bell that would echo farther than any voice ever could. 2 months after Atlas Airways declared bankruptcy, the iron birds with golden wings that had once symbolized American pride now lay scattered across airports like giant corpses waiting to be dismantled. The name Atlas Airways was slowly peeled off terminal walls, replaced by blank white signs. An empire that took 7 decades to build had collapsed in just 7 hours. Wall Street no longer spoke of Atlas as an event, but as a lesson. Yet in the shadow of failure, Marcus Ellison had not forgotten one thing. Justice is only complete when we don't stop at destroying what's wrong, but go on to rebuild what's right. On a morning draped in light rain, Daniel Park entered Marcus's office in London. Condensation clung to the glass walls, and on the desk sat a thick folder marked with the old Atlas logo. "You kept these files?" Daniel asked, his voice laced with surprise. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He stood by the window gazing down at the stream of headlights, flowing like a river of light. "A system can die, but people cannot. The pilots, the engineers, the technicians, they weren't at fault. They were victims of a broken culture." Daniel sat down and placed the folder on the desk. Atlas has filed for liquidation. The remaining assets are valued at about $1.2 billion if sold off in pieces. Creditors are looking for buyers, but no one dares touch that name. Marcus turned his eyes glowing, as though a flame burned behind them. Then we won't buy Atlas. We'll buy what's left of it, and build something new. He called it the Phoenix Gambit, a plan as bold as it was insane to buy all of Atlas's assets through a hidden investment firm, rebuild the company from the ashes, and bring it back to life, but with an entirely new soul. Daniel looked at him, half astonished, half uneasy. Are you sure that name is cursed? Who would ever trust an airline that became the face of discrimination? Marcus replied with calm conviction. No one. And that's exactly why they need someone willing to believe first. 4 weeks later, Ellison Holdings, a shell company Marcus quietly founded, began submitting bids to acquire Atlas assets during bankruptcy proceedings. The auction floor at the Federal Court of New York became the center of the financial world. Major funds like BlackRock, Silver Point, and Horizon Capital came to observe but quickly withdrew when Marcus proposed an unprecedented full purchase, taking both debt and assets. The financial world called him insane. The media wrote Marcus Ellison, the man who brought down Atlas, now wants to buy its ashes. But Marcus offered no explanations. He let action speak for him. In court, the judge asked bluntly, "Mr. Ellison, why do you want to take over a brand that has lost all reputation?" Marcus met the judge's gaze and answered, his voice sharp as steel. Because the people inside never lost their dignity. They simply worked for those who forgot it. The courtroom fell silent. The very next day, the creditors' board voted unanimously to approve Ellison Holdings' proposal, not just for the money, but for the belief behind it. 3 months later, the acquisition was finalized. Marcus became the legal owner of Atlas's entire infrastructure routes, aircraft, and core workforce. He renamed the company Momentum Airlines, a name that meant motion constant progress forward. On launch day, his speech lasted only 90 seconds, but within 24 hours it was shared more than 10 million times. We cannot change the past, but we can ensure it never repeats itself. Momentum will not just be an airline. It will be proof that respect can fly farther than any plane. A month later, at New York's JFK Airport Hangar 7, once Atlas's old maintenance base, displayed a new banner, Momentum Airlines Dignity Takes Flight. More than 2,000 former employees gathered for the first all-staff assembly. No one knew what to expect, a distant billionaire. A rehearsed speech. But when Marcus walked onto the platform, in his familiar grey hoodie, without bodyguards, without a chest microphone, the entire hangar fell silent, so silent that the wind could be heard whistling through the steel doors. He spoke slowly. "Perhaps you think I'm the man who destroyed Atlas. You're partly right, but not entirely. I only cut away the tumor that was killing a body still worth saving." He paused, scanning the crowd. His eyes met those of engineers, attendants, and pilots, people who had lost everything because of someone else's mistakes. "Atlas died because it believed power came from the seat you occupied," Marcus said firmly. "But I believe true power comes from how we treat others. From this day forward, Momentum has no first class, no second class. We have only one value: respect." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling into a storm. Some wept. Others pressed their lips tight, nodding in silence. A man in the back row, a former Atlas pilot, whispered softly, "For the first time in my life, I believe the boss knows how to fly with his heart. That night, Marcus walked alone through the empty hangar. In the darkness, the massive planes loomed like sleeping birds. He reached out and touched the cold metal skin where the new words had been painted, Momentum Airlines. His hand trembled, not from cold, but from emotion. He whispered, as if speaking to the past itself, I'm sorry I had to destroy you, but without the fire, how could the light ever be born? Across the ocean, Linda Barrett watched the special news broadcast on television. The screen showed Marcus standing on stage, speaking about dignity and second chances. She sat still for a long time, then smiled faintly, a sad but honest smile. At least he did what I never had the courage to do, to admit a mistake and turn it into something good. In a world where power had once built walls, one man chose to break them and build doors instead. From the ashes of prejudice, Momentum took flight not on fuel alone, but on the belief that respect can carry humanity farther than any airplane ever could. 1 year after Momentum Airlines' first flight, the world of aviation had changed. Once branded the public relations disaster of the century, the name Marcus Ellison now appeared on the cover of Time magazine, with the headline, The Man Who Rebuilt the Sky. From ashes, Momentum had become a symbol of rebirth, a place where human values rose above profit and respect became the new fuel of the service industry. But that journey wasn't easy, and for Marcus, victory was never the destination, it was merely the beginning of a greater responsibility. That morning, Momentum Flight 01 took off from London to New York, marking exactly 1 year since the airline's rebirth. The press television crew's VIP guests and hundreds of employees were there to celebrate. Yet no one knew that Marcus, the founder himself, was on board, quietly seated in his familiar grey hoodie at seat 2A. As the Boeing 787 climbed above the clouds, sunlight poured through the window, illuminating his face. A young flight attendant approached her, smile bright, her eyes sincere. "Good morning, Mr. Ellison. It's an honor to have you on our anniversary flight. What would you like before takeoff?" Marcus smiled faintly, his voice calm and warm. "Champagne, Winston Churchill, if you still serve it." She nodded without the slightest hesitation. "Of course, sir. It would be my pleasure." When the crisp pop of the cork echoed, Marcus closed his eyes. A year ago, that sound had been a wound. Today it was a song of triumph. The first-class cabin was filled with a quiet, natural joy, free of arrogance. The attendants smiled not because they were paid to, but because they were allowed to be human. Passengers of every color and background spoke to each other as equals, not as masters and servers. Marcus looked around, and a wave of emotion washed over him, part pride, part humility. He realized he hadn't just revived a company, he had resurrected a culture. On live television in New York, a reporter announced, 1 year after the historic collapse, Momentum Airlines, the successor of Atlas Airways, has set a new record, the highest customer satisfaction rate in the industry revenue, up 40% above forecast, and named the most desirable workplace of 2032. Across major airports, the phrase, "Dignity takes flight," filled digital billboards. The story had become a modern legend of a billionaire who didn't use power for revenge, but to correct the mistakes of a generation. But not everyone rejoiced. In a small rented house on the outskirts of Dallas, Richard Whitmore, the former CEO of Atlas, sat staring at the television where Marcus was being honored. His hair had turned completely white, and the hands that once signed billion-dollar contracts now trembled as they held a cheap cup of coffee. On screen, Marcus spoke at a press conference I didn't save a company. I simply proved that respect can be a business model. Whitmore froze. A drop of hot coffee fell on his hand. But he didn't feel it. In his faded eyes reflected the image of the man he once looked down upon, now standing where he himself could never reach. He turned off the television. In the dark, his voice broke into a whisper. He did what I should have done, but it's too late. At the same time, in Queens, Linda Barrett sat by the window of a small cafe. On her table lay an old newspaper with the headline, "From Disgrace to Grace." The flight attendant who started it all, a young journalist, had found her and asked to retell the story from the perspective of the one who caused it. Linda reread the interview over and over. In it she said, "I once thought a smile was just part of the job. Now I understand sometimes a smile can save an entire company if it's given with respect, not obligation." She no longer flew, but every week she volunteered at Momentum's training center, working with the Second Chances program that retrained former airline employees to return to the skies. When she told her story, the room always fell silent, not in judgment, but in understanding. In their eyes, Linda was no longer the one who caused disaster, but the witness of awakening. At Momentum's headquarters in London, Daniel Park walked into Marcus's office with a smile. "You see, you've made the entire industry relearn the meaning of service." Marcus stood before the vast glass wall, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery red. He replied quietly, "No, I just made them relearn the meaning of being human." Daniel chuckled softly, half joking, half sincere. "You know they're calling Momentum the airline with a soul." Marcus smiled faintly. "Then our mission is to make sure that soul is never forgotten. Because the moment people think they're good enough, that's when they start to decay again." That evening, Marcus stepped onto the runway. A Momentum 787 had just landed the sunset, bathing its silver body in orange light. He placed his hand on the warm metal wing, feeling the heat from its journey. His mind drifted to a memory, a young black boy standing outside an airport fence, watching planes take off with eyes full of dreams. That boy had never imagined that one day he would be the one teaching the world how to treat others with kindness 35,000 feet in the air. A single tear slipped down his cheek, carried away by the wind. That night, Marcus received an email from a passenger, a single mother who had once been denied a ticket by another airline for being inappropriately dressed. She wrote, "On Momentum Flight 204. Your crew laid a blanket over my son, called him Captain Junior, and let him visit the cockpit after landing. I've never seen anyone make a child feel that special. Thank you for creating a world where respect no longer has to be asked for." Marcus finished reading and smiled. He needed no money, no fame, only a generation that knew how to smile from the heart. The sky had once been high, cold, and indifferent, but now it had learned how to bow to the dignity of humankind, and Momentum flew not only on wings, but on the belief that when respect becomes instinct, the world will no longer need correction. 3 weeks after Momentum Airlines' anniversary celebration, the sky over Chicago was a rare, brilliant blue. That morning, Marcus Ellison appeared at the International Conference on Ethics and Leadership in Business, gathering representatives from more than 20 countries, hundreds of CEO scholars and journalists. The host introduced him as the symbol of corporate justice in the 21st century. When Marcus walked onto the stage, he carried no notes, no slides, no speech, only a story. He began with a faint smile. 3 years ago, I was refused a glass of champagne on a flight. The audience chuckled softly, thinking he was telling a joke. But then he continued his voice, calm and even yet, each word sharp enough to pierce the air. The problem wasn't the drink. It was the fact that sometimes those who hold the power to serve forget the meaning of service. And sometimes those who have the privilege to stay silent forget that silence itself is complicity. The hall went still. He paused for a few seconds, the stage light casting half his face in brightness, half in shadow. That day I didn't get angry. I simply gave an order to sell all my shares. When the plane landed, an empire had fallen. People called it revenge, but I called it awakening. He went on, his tone slow and steady, as if revisiting memories. After that incident, I received thousands of messages. Some congratulated me. Some called me ruthless. But among them, there was one letter I could never forget. It was from a former Atlas employee, a woman who had lost her job. She wrote, "Mr. Ellison, I was the one who once looked down on a customer simply because he wasn't like me. I didn't realize what I had done until I saw the world collapse from that mistake. But thanks to you, I learned that sometimes to save a system, you have to let it burn." Marcus stopped, his eyes glistening. That letter didn't make me proud. It made me ache. Because I realized we've lived too long in organizations that treat politeness as a standard, while forgetting that respect is the foundation. The hall was silent. He took a deep breath, then continued, "Justice doesn't come from a courtroom or a stock exchange. It begins in the moment one person dares to say, 'Enough.' Enough to prejudice, enough to arrogance, enough to power that forgets humanity." His gaze turned to the front row where corporate leaders sat with serious faces. "And if any of you still think justice is about punishment, then you have understood nothing. True justice is when people learn not to repeat their mistakes." The applause that followed lasted more than 2 minutes. Some stood. Some bowed their heads. And in the back corner of the room, Brenda Cole, the journalist who once broke the story of Atlas's collapse, quietly took notes. She knew she wasn't just witnessing a CEO speak. She was witnessing a philosopher wearing a suit. After the talk, Brenda found Marcus backstage. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked directly. Marcus thought for a moment, then replied, "No. But I do feel sorrow." "Sorrow for what? Because maybe I could have taught them that lesson without costing thousands their jobs. But sometimes it takes the ground splitting open before people finally look down." Brenda said nothing. She understood that behind his calm exterior was a soul that had never truly found peace. That afternoon, Marcus flew back to London. During the flight, he gazed out the window where the sea of clouds rolled like silver waves below. A young flight attendant approached, bowing politely. "Mr. Ellison, would you like some champagne?" He smiled softly. "No, thank you. Just water." She nodded and walked away. Marcus watched her as she gently bowed again, while handing water to an elderly passenger a few rows behind, an act small yet full of grace. He smiled faintly, because he knew he no longer needed that glass of champagne. What he wanted to see was already here, in the way one human being treated another with sincerity, without agenda. When he returned to London, night fell quietly. The city glimmered through the mist, its lights reflecting on the glass walls of the Momentum office. Daniel Park was waiting. "Your speech went viral," Daniel said. "Social media is exploding. Some are calling you the Martin Luther King of business." Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. Don't compare me to him. I'm just a man who was once refused a drink and who learned how to turn humiliation into light." Daniel looked at him seriously. "You've done far more than that, Marcus. You've made the world remember that ethics can have economic value." Marcus was silent for a while, then turned to him and said quietly, "No, Daniel. I just want people to understand that respect doesn't need a budget. It only needs a heart free of bias." Late that night, Marcus stepped onto the balcony. Below, the slow stream of London traffic shimmered like a second sky. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. From afar, the faint roar of a jet engine echoed. It might have been a momentum flight leaving the airport. He thought about his journey from a refused drink to the fall of an empire, to the rebirth of an idea. Everything had begun the moment humanity forgot its own value. Now, as the world had changed, Marcus carried one quiet wish, that someday people will no longer remember my name, because by then respect will have become ordinary. And at 35,000 feet among endless clouds, momentum kept flying, not just carrying passengers, but carrying the belief that sometimes justice doesn't begin in a courtroom, but in the way one chooses to fill a glass. 3 years later, morning mist blanketed London in a veil of silver. High above a momentum, A350 climbed through the clouds, leaving behind a soft white trail stretched across the dawn like a thread drawn over the horizon. In his 72nd floor office, Marcus Ellison stood by the window, one hand resting against the cool glass, watching the plane disappear into the sky. Behind him hung a black and white photograph of an old Atlas Airways aircraft, being dismantled with a single line beneath it. "Sometimes you have to take the past apart, so the future can fly." On the desk, Daniel placed an envelope. "You should read this. It's from Linda Barrett." Marcus opened it. The handwriting trembled slightly, but each stroke remained steady. "Mr. Ellison, I've retired, but I still visit the Momentum Training Center every week. I tell the young trainees about a man who was once denied a glass of champagne and turned it into a lesson for the entire world. They ask me if I regret it. I tell them yes, but I'm grateful, because through my mistake, millions have learned to see the human being in one another. Thank you for not hating me." Marcus folded the letter and sat in silence for a long while. Outside, the sky turned a pale gold, its reflection softening his face, the light of forgiveness and peace. That afternoon, Momentum announced a new program, the Human First Initiative, a global effort to bring the philosophy of people first into every part of aviation. Other airlines began to follow, not out of trend, but because they understood it was the only future worth building. The media called Marcus the man who made ethics a business model, but he simply smiled. "No," he said in an interview, his voice gentle yet firm. "I'm just a man who was once humiliated and chose to turn that humiliation into light." That evening, Marcus boarded a flight to Tokyo. Seat 2A. Before takeoff, a flight attendant leaned forward and asked softly, "So would you like a glass of Winston Churchill champagne?" Marcus smiled, his eyes kind and distant. "No, thank you. Just a glass of water. I already have everything I need." He looked out the window as the sun sank beyond the edge of the earth, a horizon painted in red like fire, but all he saw within it was light. And so, from one glass of champagne, denied the world learned again how to serve with heart. Justice was no longer about punishment, it had become awakening, because sometimes to change the entire sky, all it takes is one person brave enough to begin from their own pain. An autumn afternoon in Tokyo. Sunlight slanted through the glass walls of Narita Airport, spilling across the floor like a ribbon of pale gold. Marcus Ellison had just finished a meeting with Japanese partners who wanted to bring Momentum's human-first philosophy into their education and healthcare systems. As he stepped out of the room, he paused before the wide window, gazing toward the runway, where a Momentum 787 had just lifted off the sunlight, reflecting on its silver body, like an arrow of light piercing through the clouds. Beside him, Daniel Park spoke softly. "Do you see it? You started with a single glass of champagne, and now the whole world is pouring respect back into itself." Marcus smiled. "Not me, Daniel. Them. I just showed them how to see one another again at an altitude where people usually forget who they are." He said nothing more. A gentle breeze drifted through, carrying the scent of jet fuel mixed with the faint trace of rain. It was the smell of movement, of change, the very thing Marcus loved most. That evening he visited a special classroom run by the Momentum Foundation. The students there were young men and women who had made mistakes, who had once been denied a second chance by society. When Marcus entered, no one knew who he was. They only saw a man in a grey hoodie sitting quietly among them, listening. A young woman stood and spoke. "I was once rejected from a job because of my past. But when Momentum hired me, the interviewer said, 'We don't hire you for who you were, but for who you are today.' In that moment, I cried." Marcus sat still, his heart heavy with emotion. In that instant, he understood true justice isn't about reversing the scales, but about rebuilding the trust that was broken. Late that night, he returned to his hotel. Outside, Tokyo shimmered like an artificial sky. He opened his laptop and looked at the headline on Momentum's website, "Respect is the new altitude." He typed a single line into his personal journal. "I once thought justice was power. Now I know justice is light because it doesn't burn anyone. It illuminates the way for everyone." He closed the laptop. Outside, a Momentum aircraft crossed the night sky, flashing like a moving star. Marcus watched it, smiling faintly. And so, from one small act, an empire had fallen, and a world had been rebuilt. No one spoke any more of Atlas's collapse, only of the man who, after being denied a glass of champagne, chose to teach humanity how to pour dignity back into the world. From the perspective of a leadership culture expert, the journey of Marcus Ellison is not merely the story of a glass of champagne refused, but a metaphor for an era where respect has become the new measure of power. He did not respond with anger, but with vision. He did not choose destruction, but rebirth. Because true justice is not found in punishment, but in the ability to make the world reflect upon itself. His story reminds us that sometimes, to change the entire sky, it only takes one person, brave enough to stand up and say, "Enough." If you believe that respect is the one universal language capable of healing the world, then like this video to help spread that message and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the stories where dignity is tested by prejudice and reborn through compassion. Before you go, leave a comment below with a phrase that reflects your belief in that value. Hold your dignity.